Welcome to my World History Notes, where I'm sharing things that I'm learning about the Cold War that I think are fascinating. You may already know these, or you may think they're not important, but it's fine. I'm just sharing this with you, and this isn't a professional or highly polished video. I don't have graphics or pictures or music. Just a few things I want to say that I'm finding out, learning, and that I just want people to see. Hopefully, you'll study too. I was looking at the Black Book of Communism, which is about um, basically the oppression that communist governments and stuff like that in Eastern Europe and after the war perpetrated, and just thought of the danger that America has. You just think of this is what happens with a communist government. So after the World War II in Central Europe, you always think of terror as a relation to war, but and that was in World War One. You had the concept of total war, and World War II really um, far surpassed anything they could possibly imagine in World War One. One scholar, Miguel Abensur, described quote as the democratization of death. Tens of millions of people. Total annihilation became an integral part of the idea of war in World War II. Nazi barbarism struck the entire population, particularly with the extermination of Jews. And the figures themselves are powerful. In Poland, military losses accounted for 320,000 dead, but civilian losses were 5.5 million. In Hungary, there were 140,000 military losses and more than 300,000 civilian deaths. In Czechoslovakia, civilian losses were 80 to 90% of the total. So the great terror of the war didn't come to an end with the German defeat. With the arrival of the Red Army, the fighting arm of the communist regime, all these populations underwent what's called a national cleansing, which had a very specific character in that region. Political commissars and counterintelligence units in the army under the acronyms SMERSH and NKVD were deeply involved in the operations. The repression was especially severe in the countries that had sent troops to fight against the Soviet Union. Hungary, Romania, Slovakia, where the NKVD deported hundreds of thousands to the Soviet gulags. Their exact number is still being calculated now that these archives are opened up. So, according to studies in Hungary and Russia that were published with the opening of the KGB archives and archives in other countries, very conservative numbers regarding the exact count, but hundreds of thousands of people were deported, soldiers and civilians, children as young as 13 and old men of 80. Approximately 60,000 were taken to it's called Transcarpathian region of Ukraine, which had been uh, taken over by Czechoslovakia, but was just occupied by Hungary but in 1939, in accordance with the 1938 Munich Agreement, and then annexed by the Soviet Union, um, and from Hungary. It's had a population of about 9 million in 1944, and more than I think the number here is 800,000 people were deported. The Soviet figure was 526,000, but that was based on the number of people who arrived at the camps. It doesn't take into account those who died in transit camps in Romania. There were camps in some of the names, I certainly not going to pronounce them right. Brajov, Siget, Marmatel, Moldavia, Bessarabia, Sambor. Around 75% of all deportees passed through these. Among the deportees were Jews who have engaged in the work battalions of the Hungarian army. Two-thirds of these prisoners were sent to forced labor camps, and one-third to prison camps, where the mortality rate as a result of epidemics was twice as high. Current estimates suggest that around 200,000 of these deportees from Hungary, including people belonging to the German minority, Russians who had arrived after 1920, and the French and Poles who were living in Hungary, never returned. Some of these purges were carried out by popular or quote, extraordinary courts at the end of the war and in the first months of the post-war period. Violent extrajudicial action was common, including executions, assassinations, torture, and the taking of hostages. And this was made possible by the absence of or the failure to respect any international conventions regarding prisoners of war or a civilian population. Bulgaria, which had a population of 7 million at the time end of World War II, was particularly noteworthy in this respect. Immediately after 9th of September 1944, when the Popular Patriotic Front seized power and the Red Army marched into the country, a police force and a security department controlled by the Communist Party moved into action. On October 6, people's tribunals were established by decree. By March 1945, they had issued 10,897 sentences at 131 trials and condemned 2,138 people to death, including the regents, the brother of King Boris III, high-ranking officers, policemen, judges, industrialists, and journalists. According to the specialist, a savage purge accounted for the death or disappearance of another 30,000 to 40,000 people, mainly local nobility, mayors, teachers, Orthodox priests, and shopkeepers. In 1989, thanks to witnesses who were no longer afraid to talk, previously unknown mass graves were uncovered. Yet Bulgaria never sent troops to fight the Soviet Union, and it saved most of its Jews from genocide. To get an idea of the scale of communist repression in the country, one can compare the number of victims from the period of monarchy rule from 1923 to 1944, which is often thought of as dictatorial. Let me get my next page here. So, according to an investigation by the a new parliament in 45, 5,600 people were assassinated, executed, or died in prison as a result of prison sentence during that period. Now, during the years of anti-fascist resistance from 41 to 44, only 337 people, not even all resistance fighters, were condemned to death and lost their lives. Purges under the influence of the Red Army brought about a generalized fear in all the societies. The purges affected not only those who actively supported the Nazis or local fascists, but everybody else who simply had refused to take sides. In a Bulgarian documentary made after the fall of the communist regime in the early 1990s, people recounted episodes of how there were arrested parents and children and old people were just arrested and shot. At this time, after the quote liberation by the Red Army, which according to official propaganda established international relations of a quote new type, many people tried to change their affiliations and denunciations flew thick and fast. Name changes were common. Rosenzweigs became quickly Rosanskis, and Brittenfields became Bears, Jews trying to change their names. The terror in Central and Southeastern Europe didn't stop with this. The armed struggle against the new authorities continued in Poland, prolonging the war, and also affected Slovakia in 1947 when the Bandera units fleeing from Ukraine arrived. At the same time, armed groups of former members of the fascist Iron Guard, calling themselves the Black Shawls, roamed the Carpathian Mountains. Central Europe was still prey to violent anti-Semitism. The last pogroms, or attempted pogroms, thus against the Jews, in European history took place in 1946 in Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. And then, of course, after the war, an aggressive anti-German nationalism took hold in Central Europe. It was understandable in light of the Nazi occupation. It hindered the evolution of democratic institutions and behavior. Violence was common on a day-to-day level, particularly in the deportation of millions of people. Excuse me, but especially German minorities who'd been in some regions like long before the previous centuries. More than 6.3 million Germans were forced to leave their homes in the territories of Silesia and Pomerania. 3 million were thrown out of Czechoslovakia, 200,000 from Hungary, and more than 100,000 from Yugoslavia. These people went to prisoner of war camps. Women, children, old people were forced out of their houses, apartments, businesses, workshops, and farms. This is a huge number, which took place with official backing from the Allies, from our side, in the summer of 1945, have been preceded in some countries by unofficial outbreaks of, just total violence. Like Czech nationalists have been particularly ruthless and killed several thousand civilians. There were elements of terror present in Central Europe before the installation of the communist regimes, and violence was an integral part of the recent experience and mentality of the countries concerned, societies were often powerless to resist the new wave of barbarism that was about to descend on them. The communist parties were instrumental in the new violence. Their leaders and disciples were often faithful followers of Bolshevik doctrine, enriched in the enriched in the Soviet Union under the leadership of Stalin. And I've talked to you before. The goal of their actions was clear: to ensure by any means necessary that the Communist Party had a monopoly on power, that the party played the same leading role that it did in the Soviet Union. There was never any attempt at power sharing, political pluralism, or parliamentary democracy. Even if the parliamentary system was formally retained, the doctrine in place at the time presented the Soviet Union as the glorious victor in the struggle against Nazi Germany and its allies, and the principal force and universal guide toward worldwide revolution. So local communist forces were expected to coordinate and subordinate their activities in the center of the world, communism in Moscow and its chief, Stalin. Now, the communist monopoly on power was assured almost at the moment of liberation in two countries: in Yugoslavia, where the communists were led by Josip Broz, better known as Tito, and in Albania, where Enver Hoxha had risen to the leadership of the Communist Party. These two leaders had dominated their respective national resistance movements against the Nazi or Italian invaders, and despite pressure from outside, and even from the Soviet Union, they accepted power sharing for only very limited periods, and rarely in the course of history has there been a bloodbath on the scale of the one seen in Yugoslavia. And I knew a person, as I said before, whose father had been beheaded by Tito's forces. So I'm going to stop there for now, and I want to go back to Operation Keelhaul and discuss that. I already talked about it before, but I want to point out some additional things I've learned, and just this is the horror that descended on hundreds of thousands, millions of people after World War II, inflicted by the Soviet Union, supported by our government and the Allies who won against Germany and Italy and Japan. These horrors that we allowed to happen, we encouraged them, we facilitated them, and the Soviet Union placed their communism. Communism is the most insidious ideology, the most wicked, nasty, vile political expression in human history. And you have to do everything you can, as they would say, by any means necessary, to prevent it from taking over your country. You will pay a price you do not want to pay. Like they say, you can vote them in, but you can't vote them out. They have to be thrown out. So just keep your eyes open. Thank you.